talkRADIO.
So, very good morning to you. 7 minutes past 6 o'clock. Time to welcome Albie Amankona. Albie, good morning to you.
Good morning, James.
Thank you very much indeed for coming in. So, financial analyst, political commentator, and co-founder of Conservatives Against Racism. Gives you lots to do. I dare say you probably got quite a lot to say about the various stories. The one story on the front pages of the papers, and of course you've picked it out because... you know, it's one of these things that unless or until we have conversations about the NHS, that are things ever going to get better? The Times newspaper says childbirth is not safe for women in England. That is a damning statement to make.
It's not just a damning statement to make, James. It's a terrifying statement to make. If you were a woman waiting to give birth to your first child, or indeed any child, you'd feel terrified looking at the headlines today. And of course, it comes off the back of this report into what's gone on at this hospital in Shrewsbury.
But is it fair to translate what's happening in Shrewsbury and what's happening there, and that hospital, which clearly there is a problem and has been a problem over 20 years for that NHS trust? Is it fair to then translate and transpose that to every part of the NHS? It cannot be like that across the whole organisation, can it?
Perhaps not over every part of the NHS, but when we're looking at maternity services, I think it's something like 4 in 10 maternity services are seen as unsatisfactory. Now, if we extrapolate in public satisfaction with the NHS across the board, it's at its lowest level since 1997. And James, you know better than I will about what happened in 1997. There was a Labour government, so this should really kick the government into action about making some serious reforms to the NHS.
But is it their fault? Because this is something which has been going on for 20 years. So I know that people love to politicise the NHS. Part of the problem with the NHS is that it has become so political that nobody has tackled it. Nobody will go in there, because you start to hear the cries that the NHS is being privatised and this is a problem and all this sort of stuff, where I don't know about you, but if I had the choice and I had to choose now at this moment in time and money was not a consideration, would I go private or public? You know what? I might go private.
I mean, I completely agree with you, James. The NHS has become a bit of political football over the last 20 years, but this government has been in power for half of that 20-year period that you just mentioned.
And they haven't done enough, have they?
No, they have not done enough, and that's evident from the massive waiting list that we see today and the stories on the front pages of all of the papers this morning talking about childbirth not being safe in the United Kingdom.
And my problem with the NHS is that, look, there are pockets which I'm sure are brilliant. There is a huge amount of research there which is incredible. Yes, of course, they've had to go above and beyond during the pandemic. The rollout of the vaccine has been incredible, and that was my last experience of it. But it does seem to be an organisation that is incredible at hosing money in a way that any other or any commercial entity would be horrified by. I'm assuming that until or unless we get a grip on the finances and have somebody or ministers who are able to grasp that and realise that just because this isn't an allocation of money anymore issue, this is how that money is then spent. Because when you see some of the appointments that they make of this diversity champion, that box ticker there, this process person, of course you've got to have people doing certain jobs. But if you're not focused on your day job and the thing that you're meant to do, which is let's get enough doctors in, let's get enough nurses there, and let's make sure that our research capabilities are strong, those are the things that we should be focusing on, and they seem to be taking a back seat.
I don't agree that they're taking a back seat, but when we think about the NHS budget, I think it's about £163 billion, and it's not this issue with healthcare is not just an issue which is a problem for the United Kingdom, it's a problem for the entire Western world, because demographic change means governments have to spend more money basically keeping older people healthy, and that leads to higher taxes for younger people, and that's fundamentally the problem. So healthcare budgets across the Western world are growing, while services for younger people are going down.
But when did we forget? And Jeremy Vine will happily blame actuaries, because he says that actuaries are responsible for this, because we started to live longer and we never did the algorithms and the numbers to realise that as soon as somebody lives longer, two things happen. First of all, the pension system gets decimated, and secondly, your health system becomes overrun.
That both of those things are 100% true, but I don't think we could have predicted. Well, I think my argument would be...
You get people to give up smoking. They're all living longer.
How could we have planned for a huge increase in life expectancy when a lot of these systems were coming in place in the mid-20th century? We could not have predicted that life expectancy was going to rise in the way that it has.
You can see the shape of the curve. It's not rocket science.
And that's a huge success story, James. So we can't see that as a bad thing. But now government policy has to catch up with the advancements in healthcare that have allowed us all to live longer and fuller lives. And surely that's a good thing. But policy has to catch up.
Well, they need to get on with it because they've been sitting on their hands.
Have to deal with.
They've got to pull their fingers from out their ear ends and they've got to get on with it. And part of the problem here is that I don't think that, frankly, Labour have got an alternative other than just throwing money at the problem. And that's kind of what we've done over the last 20 years, is that every time there's been an NHS crisis, we just throw money at it, as opposed to saying, do we really need to have all of these trusts and reorganisations? Do we really need to have computer systems that just don't work? Do we really need to have situations where we forget that the NHS should be run like a 7-day-a-week operation instead of Monday to Friday, and if you're at the weekend, woe betide? We've got a real problem, and we need to move to a 4-3-day work shift pattern. We need to change the way that we resource it. We need to change the way that we organise it, and we need to change the way that we supply it.
There's a lot of reform and reorganisation that could go on at the NHS, but the problem is as soon as someone speaks about perhaps private sector intervention, whether or not we're talking about opening up to market forces, everyone says the Conservatives want to privatise the NHS. If you look at healthcare systems, some of the best healthcare systems across Europe and in Israel, they all have parts of the private sector involved, whether or not that's an insurance payment system, whether or not that's a co-payment
But the thing is that people are ridiculously naive if they think that everything can be done by the NHS as a public organisation, because one of the biggest components are drugs. And drugs companies spend huge amounts of money to develop something, and then if it happens to turn into a good one, then they do make their returns back. But I'm afraid we are exposed to the market, so therefore we better get used to it and play it better, because at the moment we're running it almost, I don't know, with our heads in balaclavas and not understanding what the heck's going on. Meanwhile, Daily Telegraph, Putin's aides are lying to him, says the GCHQ chief. We'll come on to that story shortly. Rape ordeal of trans MP is the front page of the Metro. The Financial Times, Germany and Austria prepare gas rationing in standoff with Russia. Meanwhile, turning our attention to the newspaper, biggest maternity scandal in the history of the NHS. That story also on the front page of the Daily Mail. Natural birth dogma left mothers and babies to die, they say. The Daily Star focuses on Tom Parker, who has died from an inoperable brain cancer tumour. Very sad news there. The Daily Express, justice coming for every baby, they say. The Sun talks about the burglary on David Beckham's house and family. The Mirror, stolen lives, they say. Families' grief as report reveals 201 babies and 9 mums could have survived, using the word needlessly died. And the NHS maternity scandal, police investigate 600 further cases. Right, we will talk some more about the stories that you picked out, Albie, and in a moment, I can sense your excitement already, because we will have our uplifting news story of the day. That's all coming next here on Talk Radio. 18 minutes past 6 is the time, going through the papers with Albie Amankona. We've been talking about the NHS, asking you the question, whether you trust them and what needs to change. Lucy has been in touch and says, James, another thing, why are you discussing the Prime Minister's PR strategy? This is the whole problem. If the government was about doing what genuinely works instead of what looks good, we might not be in such a mess. Meanwhile, Cooperman says the NHS is complete shambles, without doubt the worst health service in the developed West. You can't see a GP. There's no chance of me ever having a checkup at the dentist ever again. 3 years now and counting, says Cooperman. Oh dear, that's not a very good situation to be in. Albie, we'll come back to your stories in a moment. Meanwhile, Lucy is in Shropshire. Lucy, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, James. I've been listening to you and just getting crosser and crosser and crosser.
Oh, what, with me?
No.
Oh, good.
No. The whole problem with the NHS, every ordinary person out here in the world will tell you, is the money it wastes on management.
Yes.
And, I mean, where I live, you could apply for a job as a diversity and inclusion officer.
Yes.
And earn a salary of £70,000. And we know that there are 23 of these people have been appointed recently. And in my own tiny little market town, we have a really swanky GP practice that was closed for the whole of COVID because of COVID work, whatever that is, in inverted commas. And I tried to get an appointment for my child, who goes to a boarding school, so is registered elsewhere. And they wouldn't see her in the holidays as a temporary resident. And her own practice, which was 2 hours away, would not answer the telephone. We had to e-consult, which she couldn't do because she's under 18. I couldn't do because I'm not registered at that practice.
So how do we cut through the red tape nightmare?
So sorry to go on about it, but because we govern by PR and focus group, which you've just been discussing with a PR consultant this morning, the government will always be too frightened to just say that this is a load of nonsense. All of these people are superfluous. They're all
Let me ask Albie what he thinks. So, Albie, let me just ask you. So, Lucy's talking about the fact that the NHS is so interested in hiring diversity and inclusion officers and on management that they can't actually focus on what they're meant to do. Is there any truth in that, do you think?
I can completely understand why people see the amount of money that these diversity chiefs and managers are being paid, 70k, 20 of them being hired. This caller says the NHS budget is over £160 billion. I just did some quick maths. 20 times 70,000 is about 1.6 million. Now, I think this whole argument about the NHS hiring diversity chiefs is a bit of a red herring. The big problem with the NHS is it wastes a lot of resources, not necessarily staffing resources, but other resources that could be clawed back through efficiency measures or better IT or things like that. And that, I think, is what we need to be focusing on instead of these red herring issues like diversity.
Right, OK, it's a red herring issue, Lucy, but there we go. Thank you very much indeed for your call. Good to chat. I'm sure we will chat again. Thank you for that. Right, let's go back to the stories that you've been picking out. So, also in the papers... is this PR spin that there is a revolt against Putin because we're trying to rabble-rouse, or is there genuine, I suppose we'll never know, but genuine concern over in Russia, particularly of his senior people, that this is this excursion into Ukraine has gone horribly, horribly wrong?
Well, if you want to call Jeremy Fleming the one of the chiefs at GCHQ PR spin, then that's up to you. But certainly... But
say, for example, if we said, the head of the KGB is speaking and said that, I don't know, something happened in Downing Street or whatever, you'd just say, well, they're just rabble-rousing.
I disagree. I think the standards of our public institutions in this country are higher than that of Russia. I hope we won't disagree on that. I trust what Jeremy Fleming has said. I understand that people don't. But what Jeremy Fleming is saying is that Putin has made a strategic miscalculation when it comes to the Ukraine war. This
is unprecedented for him to say that. Why is he saying it?
He's saying it, I think, because it's what's happening, and we need the British people to understand what is going on in the Ukraine. We can also see it from the reporting that we're seeing across media organisations, by the way. This isn't just what Jeremy Fleming is saying. Putin is pulling back troops from Kiev. We are seeing that this war, that I think a lot of us thought was going to end in Ukraine falling very quickly, hasn't come to pass because the Ukrainian resistance has been very strong and Western sanctions have been very tough.
Well, I think arguably Putin has completely misjudged the reaction of the West. He's completely misjudged what sanctions would be put in place. I think he had false expectations as to what his troops were capable of doing.
And so would you say that was a strategic miscalculation?
Yeah, I mean, I would. So
you agree with Jeremy there?
No, I do agree with Jeremy.
Okay.
And I think it's absolutely right that he said it. I just wanted to find out what you thought before I spouted my nonsense. Now, before we move on to your next story, I can sense your excitement for what can only be described as today's uplifting news story of the day. I've had to dig deep for this one. Under the banner headline of Return of Albatross. Albie, it's not a very imaginative name, is it? There's an albatross called Albie. But today, look at that.
I used to be called Albatross as a nickname by all my friends at school, and my cousins still actually call me Albatross.
Look at that.
Serendipity.
It's almost serendipity that I've picked a thing. Anyway, Albie is the only albatross thought to be living in the Northern Hemisphere. And they came up with... Anyway, yesterday spotted flying off the UK coast. Did you know that the huge seabird, it can fly for years without landing? Years it can fly. Anyway, it was seen by the RSPB, which Jeremy Clarkson once incorrectly referred to as the Royal Society for the Prevention of Birds. Anyway, he got into a lot of trouble for that. Protection, obviously. Helpers soaring near a nature reserve in Bridlington in East Yorkshire. The South Atlantic bird has lived in Europe since 2014 after getting lost. His UK visits in 2017, 2020 and 21 drew thousands of bird watchers, including TV's Bill Oddie. Are you excited by that?
I'm absolutely thrilled. I can't believe this is the first time I've heard of this story, James, because when I was younger, I was absolutely obsessed with birds, and especially albatrosses, because they were so similar to my name. Now I've got one named after me.
Well, then, exactly. Or maybe you're named after it.
Maybe, although I was born 20 years before 2014, so I think it was named after me.
Okay, it was. All right, let's just pretend that's the case. Brilliant. Now, let's go back to the stories you picked out. So, this is a story about Bruce Willis. Look, I mean, we all know who he is, and this is really quite a tragic story.
It's a hugely tragic story. Bruce Willis is one of the most famous actors across the world, known for his films Armageddon, Die Hard, just to name a few. And
Not slapped anybody in public.
Not slapped anyone in public. Not like the other famous William in Hollywood, Will Smith, of course. But I think that story's been covered a lot. And let's focus on Bruce Willis. He's been diagnosed with a disorder called aphasia, which basically means it means it's difficult for people with aphasia to communicate. So whether or not that's speaking, whether or not that's writing, obviously hugely important for the acting profession. And a statement has come out from his family saying that he may have to give up acting for the rest of his life. Only 67 years old, and luckily, because of good healthcare, he can probably live a much longer life now than he would have done in the mid-20th century. And I don't think that's a bad thing to link it back to our first story.
Indeed. Let's talk about the Mirror. So this is giving some clarity, I suppose, on who decided that Prince Andrew should walk up the aisle with Her Majesty for that memorial service. What did you think about Prince Andrew taking that role?
I think anyone who saw Prince Andrew walking up with the Queen at the Duke of Edinburgh service earlier on this week was probably quite surprised that that was what they saw. But
it's a
ultimately,
polite word to use it, horrified.
Yes, surprised, horrified, some might say.
Because apparently it says here, the Queen overruled Charles on Duke's rule, and William also raised fears more than once. I mean, I don't know why on earth she would decide to have... I know, he's her favourite son, blah, blah, blah. But this guy is, he's a royal pariah. He's toxic to the institution of monarchy, and yet she decided to make that gesture.
But this, for me, this was the Queen's day. She's the Queen 365 days a year. She's been doing the job for 70 years. And on this one day, she wanted to make a decision which was right for her.
Yeah, well,
and I am not
for the institution.
Well, perhaps not, but it was right for her. She's a 95-year-old woman. She's in a lot of pain, and she wanted the support from her favourite son. And I don't think we can blame her for that.
I do. Anyway, well, if the monarchy falls, then so be it. Let's talk about this story in the Times newspaper. Trans cyclists blocked from Kenny race. This is a late intervention from cycling's global governing body. Have they made the right decision?
I think the institutions of sports are correct in the decisions that they make, which is right for those specific sports. I know there's been a lot of controversy recently with Leah Thomas, of course, over in the US, with Laurel Hubbard in the Olympics, I think it was last year, about trans women participating in single-sex sports. And it has caused a lot of controversy, and I'm sure it's a topic which is going to keep rolling on and on and on, and there are strong opinions on all sides of this really tetchy debate, which I know you've been involved in, James.
Yes, I have, indeed. And it is possible that myself and indeed the presenter of the Breakfast Show might have slightly different views on it, so I'm probably going to tiptoe my way from that story that we seem to keep coming back to, but it's okay, because I think actually on this situation they've actually taken the right decision, because one of the things I've worked out is that individual sports must work out what's right for them and all the participants, and there are some things which you just have to take some difficult and awkward decisions. It is the conversation of our time, and there we are. Albie, if people want to find out more about you and what you do, where do they go?
They can find me on Twitter. My handle is Albie Amankona. And then they can also check out the Conservatives Against Racism for Equality website, www.carfe.org.
Albie, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Much appreciated. Meanwhile...